5 years ago, Congress passed the Taylor Force Act, which barred U.S. economic assistance to the Palestinian Authority until it stops all payments incentivizing terror. The PA's Martyr Fund, which is still around today, pays monthly stipends to the families of Palestinians killed, injured, or imprisoned for carrying out attacks against Israel. This pay-to-slay policy covers all terror attacks against Israel, including those that kill Americans. That's why the Taylor Force Act was so important. It was supposed to ensure taxpayer dollars weren't funding the killing of our own children. Unfortunately, the Biden administration resumed these payments despite the Taylor Force Act still very much being the law of the land, and at a time when these killings are still going on. Just this past February, American citizen Ilan Ganels was murdered by a Palestinian terrorist in the West Bank. I'd like to enter into the record a statement by Ilan's mom by unanimous consent.
Absolutely. Unanimous consent.
She's going through just about the worst thing that could happen to a parent. And I'd also like to welcome Ilan's brother, Simon, who traveled to D.C. today to witness this important hearing. We must honor Ilan's memory instead of fueling the hate that led to his death. Mr. Abrams, as you mentioned in your testimony, the Taylor Force Act requires the U.S. ambassador to the UN and the U.S. Secretary of State to highlight this issue on the international stage and pressure the PA to stop these payments. Mr. Abrams, to the best of your knowledge, can you think of one single time Linda Thompson Greenfield or Antony Blinken brought up this among our allies and pressed the PA to stop pay-to-slay?
Not to my knowledge, Mr. Lawler, and there is a thing called the Ad Hoc Liaison Committee, which is the international group that tries to get funding for the Palestinians, and I don't think the United States made this a big issue there either.
Not only have they not made it a big issue, they've failed completely to comply with this requirement, but they've actually been encouraging other countries to raise payments to the PA. It's absurd. And it's encouraging terrorism, violence, and corruption, and it violates our laws. And I've been especially appalled at the administration's dragging their disregard for the Taylor Force Act into negotiations regarding a Saudi Arabia-Israel normalization agreement. I've consistently said that bringing Saudi Arabia into the Abraham Accords is critical to cement Israel's role in the Middle East, but the Biden administration is going about it all wrong. Recent reports indicate that a potential deal may include Saudi Arabia resuming financial payments to the PA. And this is just another example of the Biden administration neglecting the Taylor Force Act and instead choosing to bolster the credibility of the anti-Semitic, anti-Israel, and pro-terror PA. Mr. Abrams, are you aware of these reports? And can you give a few thoughts on how this agreement could be dangerous?
If the agreement basically undermines the Taylor Force Act by getting the Saudis or others to give cash to the PA, then it really is undermining the legislation completely. And it's rewarding the PA for refusing to comply with what the Taylor Force Act demands. So as the Abraham Accords grow in importance, and maybe there's an agreement that includes Saudi Arabia, this issue becomes far more important because it would potentially allow the PA to laugh off the Taylor Force Act.
I'd like to submit an op-ed recently written by former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo and Sandra Gerber by unanimous consent.
Unanimous consent granted.
Mr. Abrams, did you read this recent op-ed by Secretary Pompeo and Sandra Gerber?
I did.
In sum and substance, they call for Saudi Arabia and the United States to create a responsible mechanism to help the Palestinian people without furthering PA corruption and support for terrorism. Specifically, they call for the establishment of a Saudi-led international aid organization independent of the Palestinian Authority or the United Nations. Do you support this idea?
I do. I think it's a terrific idea.
To our other witnesses, do you support this idea?
I would support it, yes. Congressman, I think that's one approach. I think another potential approach is using the opportunity of the leverage that Saudi Arabia has over the Palestinian Authority to actually force it to implement some of the reforms that we've discussed here today.
Look, there's no question that Saudi Arabia has the ability to have influence, and I think that's why the Abraham Accords is so important. It's why I advocated for a special envoy for the Abraham Accords so that we can focus on getting Saudi Arabia to the table. But I think one thing is fundamentally clear. The PA is a corrupt authority, and no one, including the United States nor our allies, should be in any way funding them.